Halito, and welcome to Native Chalk Talk, a podcast by natives for all. Here we're keeping our Native ancestors' stories and history alive, while also sharing with you our Native culture, traditions, and more. I'm Rachel Youngman, a Choctaw originally from Anadarko, Oklahoma. I hope you'll enjoy this journey with me as we learn from our Native American guests. And I hope you'll do me a favor. Feel free to like and share these episodes. I so appreciate it. Yakoki.
Nobody hands any jobs out in the NFL. You have to earn it. There was a small opportunity to make it. I just held to, I've got this one opportunity to try for this dream. And in my mind, it was nothing to lose and everything to gain. I was probably about a month and a half, 2 months away from totally hanging it up, and went to the last camp and had some looks and had an opportunity to come work out in Kansas City. And the rest was history.
See and share our stories at togetherwe'remore.com.
You're listening to part 2 of this series.
In part 1 of this series, my cousin Cheryl and I met at Stigler Cafe in Stigler, Oklahoma, before heading out on a journey to learn more about Mushulatubbee, one of Cheryl's ancestors, and to explore our own family history along the way. Now, before I go further, I want to make a quick mention that Acorn and Oak Crafts is who made the earrings that I'm wearing today, and it's really cold outside, and they're furry and so soft, and I just want to thank her for doing such beautiful work. She is a registered tribal artist of the Choctaw Nation, so be sure to check her out on Instagram. Again, that's Acorn and Oak Crafts. But first, I want to take a step back and tell you the story of how Cheryl and I met. So part of why I love sharing this story is because I think it reminds us all how powerful it is to put ourselves out there, to reach for connection, to seek our people and our ancestors, and to kind of piece together the stories that make us who we are. Our ancestors and our living relatives shape us in ways we may not always see. Like sometimes I wonder, did my great great grandmother Rosa and even her brothers and sisters and I share any mannerisms? Did I look like them? Were they also workaholics? What did they think about the Dawes Act? Did they know Chief Mushulatubbee? And since I can't go back in time to meet them, maybe the closest I can get is through the stories of the people who knew them and through the relatives who carry pieces of them forward. And mostly, I just want to tell their stories and keep their memories alive. I sometimes joke that I have absolutely no shame when it comes to putting myself out there and asking anyone who will listen, do you know any Coleys? Are you related to a Coley or a Kennard or a Davis? So if you're listening to this and I've ever messaged you on social media or ancestry.com, thank you for putting up with me. And if you have answered, truly thank you. So how did Cheryl and I meet? Well, it all started with my great grandmother, Ella, who passed away when I was in my late 20s. And near the end of her life, she began mentioning things, memories, like she was stepping backward through time. And I've always felt that she was revisiting one particular moment, one tragic moment that stayed with her. In an episode I did a few years ago, I told the following story. Cicero shot him, Ella said, as her declining 91-year-old mind recalled memories aloud from her childhood. She was near death now, preparing to go home to her creator, but not without first reliving the event that had occurred when she was just 7 years old. She was a child, too young to comprehend why Cicero would shoot him. But who was Cicero? Her family looked at each other, puzzled, as their Choctaw grandmother attempted to reenact with her crippled hands the horrifying situation as only her mind could best remember. And there, in her bed, she vividly replayed it over and over in her head, her words slurring through the memory aloud. If only someone could truly understand what she was feeling at that moment. How terrifying it must have been, even now, as she relived the sounds of the gunshot and the fear that shook the household. She would pass on to meet her creator soon after, the remainder of the story going with her. But why didn't she tell us of this story sooner? Because of her death, it could have been the end of the story forever, or maybe not. It would be 12 years following her death that the story was resurrected and the mystery of Cicero and his victim unraveled. Indian makes attempt to kill. That's what the Enid Daily Eagle reported in December of 1910. Cicero Coley was portrayed as a crazy 22-year-old drunken Choctaw native who had shot J.D. Anderson, the wealthiest landowner in Sulphur, Oklahoma. And his being white, while Cicero was native, made this tale the talk of the town and many other towns across the state of Oklahoma. I remembered I was living in Texas at the time when I stumbled upon this article in newspapers.com, and I had to stop and say a prayer. Whether they could hear me or not, I thanked my ancestors and God for helping me to find this story right there in black and white on my laptop, staring right back at me. There it was, a man named Cicero Coley, Coley being the last name of many of my relatives, including one Rosa Coley, who was Ella's mother. So again, Ella was my great grandmother, and her uncle Cicero was the Choctaw in the story who had tried to kill J.D. Anderson. So, who was Mr. Anderson that Cicero would want to shoot him? Listeners, you may have read the book or watched the movie Killers of the Flower Moon. And if so, you learned how back when our Native American people were taken from their homes during the removal, also known as the Trail of Tears, some tribes were granted land allotments in exchange for the millions of acres of land they had to leave behind. Once they reached Indian Territory, now known as Oklahoma, they eventually received their land, oftentimes in the amount of 160 acres. And some saw this as an opportunity to take advantage of the situation. In some cases, non natives were assigned as guardians to American Indians' land, while others, as in my family's case, bought our people as children to be so called guardians of them and their land. J.D. Anderson was one such guardian of my great grandmother. So she was sold to him for a couple $1,000s when she was only 3 years old. And she was in servitude, or you could say slavery, to him. And J.D. Anderson was also the guardian of Cicero Coley, Ella's uncle, and the guardian of Cicero's brothers and sisters. Side note for context, I know this is a lot. One of Cicero's brothers was David Coley. So that's my cousin Cheryl's great grandfather. You see where it all comes together? Rosa Coley, my great great grandmother, was one of Cicero and David's sisters. So several Coley brothers and sisters and their nieces, Ella and Mary Bell, which is Ella's half sister, were also living under J.D. Anderson's roof. So he had a monopoly on the Coley family. It's no wonder he was the wealthiest landowner in Sulphur, Oklahoma. He had taken their land allotments, an act that ultimately led to Cicero, as he was coming of age, to fight back, shooting the man who had taken his and his relatives' land. The papers made J.D. Anderson out to be the good guy, and this wild Indian just came along shooting at him through the window one evening. No one really cared about the backstory, of course. And they were always going to side with the non-native person, right? I'll read to you from the two newspaper articles that I discovered that really opened up this whole story. This first one, unfortunately, I didn't capture what newspaper it was from, so pardon me. Shots fired through an open window. J.D. Anderson of Sulphur, Oklahoma, wounded by unknown assailant. December 27th, Cicero Coley, Indian, aged 22, was arrested at Sulphur at noon today for attempt to assassinate J.D. Anderson, a wealthy stockman, last night. He fired 2 shots through the window of Anderson's home. He claims Anderson illegally held land allotment from him. J.D. Anderson, one of the richest citizens of Sulphur, was shot from behind while sitting in his home about 10 o'clock last night. 10 shots were fired, and but 2 of these took effect, the other charges lodging in the walls of the room in which Anderson was sitting. The wife and 2 children of the wounded man were sitting in the room with him at the time of the shooting, and they ran screaming into the hallway. I have wondered if that was Ella and Mary Bell, so I'm not quite sure. None saw the assailant who escaped in the darkness. The shots were fired through an open window. A posse is attempting to find the man who did the shooting, a number of citizens immediately arming and organizing. Tracks were found near the window, and those are being followed. So I think this part of the article was backing up a little bit. There is no clue to the identity of the man. Earlier they said it was Cicero Coley, but the shooting is believed to have been due to personal enmity. Anderson's wounds will not prove fatal. And then this second article is from the Shawnee Daily Herald in December of 1910. Indian makes an attempt to kill, shoots through open window at a wealthy Sulphur citizen. Sulphur, Oklahoma, December 28th. Declaring that J.D. Anderson, wealthy stockman, had possession of some land belonging to him, which he was wrongfully withholding, Cicero Coley, Indian, 22 years old, fired 2 shots at Anderson through the window of his home Monday night, seriously wounding him and narrowly missing other members of his family. Coley was arrested by Sheriff Maxwell shortly before 12 o'clock Tuesday and is declared to have confessed. He made the statement that Anderson held possession of a tract of land belonging to him by allotment and had refused to release possession of it. He was immediately placed in jail at Sulphur. Sheriff Maxwell believes Anderson will recover from his injuries. So Mr. Anderson lived while the town pitied him as being the victim of a gunshot wound by a drunken Indian. And meanwhile, injustice prevailed as these Coley family members were stripped of their allotments. Now, I'm not sure how or when this happened, but I'm trying to track this down if anyone can help me with this. Somehow, Ella and Mary Bell ended up back with their land. And also, I know David, which was Cicero's brother, he also had his land too, because Cheryl still has that land in her family, and we still have our land from Ella's descendants in our family, and we have cattle on that land. So somehow the land allotments were granted back to certain family members. I just don't know about Cicero, poor guy. I wonder if he ever got those back. Anyway, my great grandmother Ella had the right to hold those stories close, only to share openly when her mind was going, possibly trying to find a resolution to a terrifying ordeal before she passed on. However, she also came from a time in which her culture and language were being stripped from her and her fellow Choctaws. Talking about it could mean punishment, maybe even death. However, in some strange way, I feel like by telling the story, I am in some way helping her to connect to her resolution and to throw her story in the face of all who tried to silence our Indigenous people back then. You're probably wondering, how did this lead to your meeting, Cheryl? Well, thanks for following me down this rabbit hole. I now will finally connect the dots. In March of 2018, I had already spent years trying to find information about certain relatives, and I had been somewhat successful up to a certain point. But then, bam, I hit a brick wall and couldn't find anything else. So, after months of being in the desert, as I call it, where I was unable to find any more information, I prayed, for lack of better word, to my relatives again, asking if they would help me because honestly, I was done. I was tired and burned out from spending hours and hours of not getting anywhere and figured out it was time to call it a day and just be grateful for what I had found about my relatives. After that prayer, I went to bed, but then I woke up in the middle of the night and I couldn't sleep. And I was thinking about the newspaper article I had found about Cicero and the story of his shooting J.D. Anderson. And I was part of the Facebook group Indian Territory and Oklahoma. I love that group. I decided to post about Cicero's story in the group along with the newspaper article. And I asked if anyone had any Coley family members and would like to connect. Then I fell asleep, woke up the next morning, and eventually pulled up my Facebook. And I had a response on my post from Cheryl and said, this is my great uncle or something like that. And then there's also a woman named Carrie talking about, that we are related. And I started shaking because I really had put myself out there over the years quite a bit, making a fool of myself, friending every person on Facebook I could find from Oklahoma that had the last name Coley and Kennard, which is another family name. And some would accept my request, but most would never respond to me. They probably thought I was so weird. So to have someone actually respond to that post I wrote in the middle of the night just gave me goosebumps. And keeping in mind, I'm kind of one of the lucky ones that has boxes and boxes of old photos and documentation, original documents, land allotment information, all of that my aunts thankfully have saved over the years. But still, I wanted more. And I didn't want to just see facts and data. I wanted to hear their stories. So anyway, I wrote back to Carrie as quickly as I could. And thankfully, she responded to me because I would have burst if she hadn't. Not only did she know the Coleys, but as I mentioned, we are related, and her branch of the family was the missing piece I'd been searching for years. And Cheryl had also reached out saying Cicero was her great grandfather, and immediately the doors started opening, and she started telling me of ancestors I knew of, but couldn't find any more info on, and introducing me to many, many other family members I had never heard of. And to this day, we're great friends. So one thing led to another, and I ended up hosting a family reunion of sorts where we could meet in person and share our ancestral stories. Everyone brought photos. We drew with chalk on the concrete. We drew our family tree, and everyone would add parts of their family tree. So Cheryl brought a lot of family members to that event. And ironically, a lot of us looked very similar. So that was really cool. Again, like all these connections of people that you may or may not know, and you may have similar features or mannerisms. It's just crazy. But anyway, her mom, so Cheryl's mom, B, looked so much like my great grandmother, and she even knew my great grandmother. So that was amazing. So B and Ella were friends, and they and their husbands would get together. And I just found that amazing because I knew Ella my whole life, and I had never met B, never heard of B. There's this whole other part of the family, but they all used to get together, and I knew nothing about that up to that point. So for this reunion, for lack of a better term, we met up in a park in Sulphur, Oklahoma, where our ancestors used to gather very often. And we all brought photos. And what was crazy is some of the ones I brought were black and white pictures of those ancestor gatherings at those picnics in that park where we were standing right then. And wouldn't you know, the relatives that came also brought pictures from that same picnic. So just different angles, but the same picnics with the same people. It was eerie and exciting. It was like bringing the pieces of a puzzle together. Just wow. And another couple of crazy things happened. I mentioned at the time I was living in Montgomery, Texas, just north of Houston. So my cousin Keisha, who is near my age and who I met through Cheryl, she lived about 10 minutes away from me. How ironic that we had lived that close to each other, and I had been trying to find her family. She and I became great friends, and I have to thank my ancestors who listened to my plea and sent me Cheryl and Carrie and Keisha and all the others. Lived 10 minutes away from me. So crazy. Another ironic thing that happened was I brought out a photo that my Aunt Annette had provided, and it was one of many photos that we have of our Choctaw relatives, but we had no idea who some of them were. So this photo I had was a black and white photo of a sweet little girl who looks ironically just like my niece Ella. She's named after her great great grandmother. And when I pulled that picture out, Cheryl's mother B said, "Well, that's me when I was little." So all this time we had this picture, we had no idea who it was. And it happened to be a still living relative of ours, B. How crazy is that? And that B and Ella had been friends. I don't know. My mind is blown. Is your mind blown by this? Is this as crazy to you as it is to me? So cool. Since all of this, Cheryl has shared so much information and photos I haven't seen and really painted a broader picture of the world our ancestors lived in, like in episode 1 of the series when she shares about Cooper Bend and how close-knit our relatives all were in their little Choctaw community, and they helped raise each other's kids. If someone passed away and left a child, as an orphan, the rest of the family would just huddle in and take care of that child. And just think, if I hadn't put myself out there, I would never have met Cheryl or B or all these people that are part of our family. And in the whole scheme of things, we're not that far apart as cousins. So like I said, I call it making a fool of myself. I'm not ashamed. In fact, I have no shame at all when it comes to relentlessly looking for my people and trying to learn about and share their stories. Heck, I'll even say it right now. Again, if any of my listeners know of any Coley, Coley, or Canards, Canard, It's spelled many different ways. Reach out to me at ryoungmanchoctalk@gmail.com. That's RYOUNGMANCHOCTALK at gmail.com. I'd love to hear from you. And you can do this too. Reach out to people on Facebook. Ask people if they know people who know people with the last name you're looking for. And whatever you do, don't give up. And now I'd like to pay a little respect to my great great uncle Cicero by sharing with the world that he was more than just an Indian who made an attempt to kill, as the paper said. And while I share what I do know about him, I'll also play a song in the background for you that my sister wrote and played on her Indian flute that I titled Cicero's Story. You may have actually heard this song in some of the commercials I make. I've played it here and there in an attempt to keep Cicero's memory alive. For those of you listening and not watching this video, I'll be showing some photos of Cicero, also Cicero with his family. But my favorite picture of him is when he's on a horse wearing a cowboy hat and holding a rope like he's about to rope a steer or something. That's exactly how I picture him anytime I'm thinking of him. Cicero Coley was born on June 15th, 1888, to Joe and Sophie Coley. Joe was Choctaw, and Sophie, her maiden name was Kennard. She was Creek. I know from my research that Cicero attended Dwight Indian Mission, and his teacher was his older brother, Edmund Coley. Now, Edmund has an interesting story because he and his dad, Joseph Coley, killed my great great grandmother Rosa's husband, who was a posse. And there's a whole other story about that I'll tackle someday. But point being, because of Joseph and Edmund being put in prison, and then they eventually passed away soon after. On July 30th, 1904, Sophie Kennard Coley, so that's Rosa's mom, she sold some of her children, including Cicero, to J.D. Anderson. And after her son and her husband had died, they had gone from the newspapers called them a prominent Choctaw family, to her having to sell her children to J.D. Anderson, and she actually ended up living with a family in servitude to them. So she was a housemaid from there on out. Very sad story. So again, she sells her children to J.D. Anderson, and then 6 years later, at age 22, Cicero shot J.D. Anderson. I'll read to you now from Cicero's obituary. Last rites for Cicero W. Coley. Cicero W. Coley, retired rancher who had lived in the Sulphur area for some 55 years, died July 31st at the Arbuckle Memorial Hospital after an illness of 1 month. Coley's home was at 1420 West Wynnewood. Coley was born June 15, 1888, near Stigler, Oklahoma. He was a member of the Baptist Church. Funeral services were conducted Thursday, August 2nd at 10:30 a.m. Coley is survived by his wife, Mrs. Minnie Coley of the home, a stepson, John Plant from Houston, Texas, 2 sisters, Mrs. John Goldsmith and Mrs. Rufus Anderson of Sulphur, and a brother, Frank Coley from Stigler. By the way, you'll notice one of his sisters was Mrs. Rufus Anderson of Sulphur. Side note that one of J.D. Anderson's sons married Cillian Anderson, who was one of the brothers and sisters under his guardianship. So Cillian is, under the guardianship of J.D. Anderson, and she marries his son. Kind of interesting. Something I'm not sure why they left out of the obituary was that Cicero served our country. He was Private Battery F in the 56th Field Artillery Unit in World War I. Certainly worth noting, right? Yakoki to all of our servicemen and women. And that is the crazy story of how I met my cousin Cheryl. I like to think that our ancestors, and especially Cicero, brought us together. And maybe they're looking down on our friendships and smiling. I hope you too will relentlessly seek to learn and share about your ancestors. What a beautiful way to honor them. Next up, Cheryl and I continue our adventures into Choctaw Country to learn more about our own family as well as her ancestor, Mushulatubbee. So stay tuned, Yakoki.
Stay tuned for part 3 of this series.
Thanks for listening to Native Chalk Talk.
Be sure to join our community on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, and check us out at nativechoctalk.com. Stay tuned for the next episode. You're going to love it. Okie. Thank you, my friends.